Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be talking about a show that I wouldn't typically talk about too much nowadays, as at this point I do feel pretty removed from this series, but with this being the 10th anniversary of the show, Kaizoku Sentai Gokaiger, the 35th anniversary season of Super Sentai, and probably one of the greatest pieces of fan service in the history of media, it just felt right for me to revisit the series here and talk about it. And if you don't know what Super Sentai is, it is the show that Power Rangers gets its footage from. Power Rangers was one of my favorite shows as a kid, and obviously as I grew up I found out that the fight footage from Power Rangers is actually taken from Super Sentai. And for the 35th anniversary of Super Sentai, the series decided to go pretty much all out in embracing the history of the series. They brought back actors from previous seasons. They made a bevy of tribute episodes to previous seasons of the show. They added this really awesome mechanic of the Ranger keys that the protagonists used to morph into previous Sentai teams. And it adds another level of fan service where we obviously get to see the old suits back and some of the same fighting styles from the original series. And through this, we also get many references within the mechas of the series and many modifications that incorporate elements from previous Sentais. And all this is just really fun. I mean, I do think this season is the best of both worlds, where it appeals to new viewers through its really great cast, probably one of my favorite casts from any Sentai series, but also having everything from a super fan's wet dream in terms of fan service, where this season literally does everything it could possibly do to reference elements from the show's history. Now, the main story of the series does obviously follow the Gokaigers, a group of space pirates that come to Earth to obtain the greatest treasure in the universe, which is done by getting the greater powers of the former Sentai teams. Now, why is this the case? Who knows, but I do like this as a way to introduce more fan service to the series. This obviously causes the Gokaigers to have to interact with these previous teams in order to get these greater powers. And through this, over the course of the entire series, you do eventually get a cameo from at least one actor from every season of the show. Now, they do end up fighting against the Space Emperor Zanyak, who, to be honest, are pretty terrible villains. I really feel like the main antagonists of this series lack so much depth. And a lot of that comes from the fact that the series is so focused on the protagonist, plus also all these references to previous seasons, that they don't really have time to really give much depth to the villains. And because of that, the villains here really just come off as like being evil for evil's sake. But they really do hit it home with the heroes here. I personally love Captain Marvelous, who is Gokai Red. While he isn't the most complex character in the world, he's a really likable and rootable leader for the group. Kind of your perfect anti-hero, especially for a Sentai series. You got Joe and Luca, who are Gokai Blue and Yellow respectively, and they're pretty standard characters from a Sentai perspective. Again, they're not super complex, they're not given much development, but they're already pretty solid characters and are very well acted. Dawn, who is Gokai Green, is probably the most individually developed character within the group, and is a really likable character as a whole. Ahim, or Gokai Pink, is probably the most forgettable member of the team for me personally, and she's usually associated as one of the two weaker members of the group along with Dawn, though she does get a relatively expansive backstory, especially in comparison to some of the other characters. Then we have the sixth member in Guy, who is Gokai Silver, and he's another really fun personality. And what I loved about this character in particular is that he is a super fan of the previous Sentai teams, and he would freak out if something cool happened or they met some former characters, and this just really felt like Guy was introduced here to really embody the superfan audience of the show. Navi is the robotic parrot that serves as their main ally throughout the series and guides them to some of the greater powers, but most of the time he ends up being used for comic relief. Now, I did mention that the main antagonists in the series kind of suck, but the side antagonist in Bosco is actually a really great villain. I mean, he's a former crewmate of Marvelous, and through that really just acts as the antithesis to him, with him also trying to obtain the greatest treasure in the universe as well, and they have some really great back and forths throughout the series. I do feel like he's easily the best villain in this season, and really should have been the main antagonist if you're asking me. But now with the characters out of the way, I do feel like we should talk about the individual episodes. Now, I'm obviously not going to talk about every single one, there's 51 episodes, but we'll talk about the highlights, we'll talk about all the tribute episodes, we'll talk about any episode that's important. So let's get started. Also, let's start with the premiere, where right off the bat, we do get the Great Legend War, this really epic battle between the Zanyak Armada and the 34 previous Sentai teams. And again, this is a really great way to start off this anniversary season, to see every Ranger in this massive battle, which is so fun to watch. The rest of the episode, though, is your typical Sentai premiere, with us being introduced to the Gokaigers, though it is interesting how they're already fully formed, and it's through flashbacks later on in the series that we do eventually see how they came together to begin with. But overall, I do feel like this was a pretty solid premiere. Episodes 2 and 3 are a mini arc that act as a tribute to Magi Ranger and involve a cameo from Magi Red, and we do also get the introductions to the mecha for the series, and get our first tribute morphing sequence that uses the motifs of the original and the music, and this is something that happens in every tribute episode, but again, considering this is the first time we see it, again, it's really nice to see it there. Again, another way for them to honor the history of the series. After a filler episode, we do get to episode 5, which is a Deca Ranger tribute, which was really fun for me personally. I was a big Deca Ranger fan. It's one of my favorite seasons, so to see the return of a decent amount of characters here, and we see Bond, Jasmine, and Donkey Kruger return here. That was really cool to see, and obviously we get a new mecha formation as well, which is pretty common from a lot of the tribute episodes. Episode 7 is another tribute episode, this one being of Geki Ranger, and for me, this one's fine. I mean, I think for me, as you would expect, I mean, I really attach to the tribute episodes that are related to series that I personally really love. And Geki Ranger is a series that I just was like okay with, but like overall this episode is still pretty strong. I mean, we see the return of Geki Red and see him train Doc and him, who do have some development through this episode, though really a lot of this episode does feel like a glorified filler episode where the character of Geki Red just takes the place of any standard one-off character. Episode 9 is a Go Ranger tribute, and this one's fine. I mean, this is probably the worst one of the ones we've talked about so far. They do go to Animarium, and they do get Gao Lion, who does look different for some reason from the original series, but mostly I did feel like this was one of the weaker tribute episodes. Episodes 11 and 12 are Shinkenger tribute episodes, and these were also another solid group of episodes, kind of similar to Geki Ranger, where like Shinkenger's not my favorite series in the world, but I did think the quality of these episodes were that of a really strong set of filler episodes where we do get a lot of focus on Joe, and it's probably a set of episodes that do stand better on their own merits than a lot of the other tribute episodes if you had taken out the tribute elements of it. Episode 14 is one of the wackier episodes, being a Car Ranger tribute, which, if you don't know, Car Ranger was essentially a Sentai parody series that was part of the main series. And this episode follows that tone. It's really weird. I mean, we see Insarn, one of the Zanyak generals, falling in love with Red Racer, and Red Racer ends up getting the Gokaigers to help him teach kids about traffic safety, and it's all really dumb. But, I mean, again, it's really enjoyable, though, if you get the context of what they're going for here. Episodes 15 and 16 are a really great set of episodes, giving us the first appearance of Bosco, and along with him come the 6 hero keys, and that leads to some really great fight sequences, and really just whenever Bosco is around, it does make the episode feel better. It feels like there's some actual stakes to the episode, with Bosco usually outsmarting them throughout his appearances. But it's after episode 16 that we do get to the film, the Gokaiger Goseiger Super Sentai 199 Hero Great Battle. And this film does take place, again, within the main series, which I do find it strange how, like, the rest of the series assumes you have watched this movie. And, like, everything within this movie is canon to the overall series, and everything that happens here is canon to the overall series and is mentioned throughout the rest of the series. But this is, again, another pretty masterfully executed piece of fan service. I mean, if we're taking at it on its own merits, I mean, it is pretty sloppily told. I mean, it is mostly a story used as a vehicle to deliver on a whole bunch of fan service. But I think on that element of it, it really succeeds. I mean, we start off with the expanded look of the Legend War, this time seeing it from the Gosager's point of view, and we started off seeing them like kind of on the down with their mechas destroyed and everything, but then we see the appearance of all the extra heroes that help them out, and then that leads to the great battle. Like, it's a really awesome scene. But also, this movie does act as a team-up movie between Gokaiger and Goseiger, which does happen every year in Super Sentai, or at least at this point in Super Sentai history, where they would have a crossover movie, and this was the crossover movie for Gokaiger, since they also added in a whole bunch of fan service with it. We do see the return of numerous notable villains from the series, including the Black Cross King, the original antagonist of Go Ranger. which was the original series. At the end of the film, we see this massive fight with all the main mechas throughout the series. Again, this is just really awesome to see. I mean, there's some really bad CGI during these scenes, but still, it's just such an awesome piece of fan service. But again, just like the main series, there's so many cameos from previous characters, and really just feels like the perfect piece of fan service. Again, like as its own individual piece of media, I don't think it works nearly as well, but having all the context of the previous Sentai series, and even if you're just a fan of Power Rangers, I do think this is something you should definitely watch. Now for the next few episodes, which are focused around Gokai Silver, who, as I mentioned before, is a great character. I did really enjoy this stretch of episodes, particularly episode 18, where we see how Guy got his powers, and we see the return of the 3 dead 6 hero characters in Dragon Ranger, Time Fire, and Abba Killer. We see them hand down their powers to him. Again, does this make sense narratively? No, but it's still a really cool fan service moment. And we do get to see his mecha, which obviously takes inspiration from their previous mechas. And in episode 19, we see him get the armor of the 15 warriors, or gold mode, which is a Battleizer-esque power-up that gives him the powers of the 15 former 6th heroes. And this armor does look ridiculous, but again, it's such a cool nod to the history of the show, and it's, again, just really awesome to watch whenever he uses it. We get a couple more tribute episodes after this, both of them being pretty strong. I mean, episode 20 is a Gingaman Tribute, and this gives Guy some development where he tries to become an integral member of the team, but we also see the return of Ryuma and Hyuga, and there's some really awesome moments there from, obviously in the original Gingaman, the main antagonists of that series were pirates, and obviously with the heroes of this series being pirates, that does lead to some interesting dynamics there, and I really like how they handled it. The next episode is a Bokenger tribute, and the tribute part of it is fine, but I did like how they connected to the rest of the series by giving us more context behind the relationship between Captain Marvelous and Akka Red. Episode 23 is a tribute to Go-Go 5, and I think this is one of the worst tribute episodes. I personally found this one pretty boring. But then we get to episodes 25 and 26, a 2-part tribute episode to Hurricaneger, which also acts as a full crossover between the two groups, where we see the 3 main Hurricanegers come back 9 years after that series aired, which is like just incredible to see. Again, the fact that the producers cared enough to bring back all 3 original Hurricanegers shows just how much care they had for the fans when making this series. I mean, there's no benefit for them doing this for the kids that generally watch this show. And really, I mean, obviously this goes throughout the series as a whole. Like, it just shows so much effort that the production of the show put into it that shows their love for the show, as again, I don't see any true benefit for doing so for their casual audience. Episode 28 is another one of the greatest accomplishments of Gokaiger, with this being a tribute episode to Jetman, which ended in 1992 on a cliffhanger of Guy Yuki, Black Condor, looking like he's dying in the final moments of the series, and here in this episode, we get the resolution to that. And with the Gokaigers interacting with him under the assumption that he's alive, until later in the episode they get confirmation that he's in fact dead, that he was a ghost the entire time. And again, we see this storyline from 19 years before the airing of this episode get concluded. Like, it's really insane that they actually did something like that. Like, that's something you rarely see in any piece of media, to see a storyline from nearly 2 decades ago get followed up on, despite not being mentioned at all in between that period of time. After that, we get to episode 29, which is a Abba Ranger tribute, and it's fine. I mean, there's some comedy relief there from the inclusion of Abba Pink, and we do get a new mecha there. But again, for me, I feel like this was kind of just a pretty average tribute episode. And the same thing goes for episode 30 as well, which, I mean, to be fair, it's probably because it's a Live Man tribute, which never appealed to me personally, as Live Man's one of the few series that I never got to watch, and I really have no experience with it at all. So this episode didn't really connect to me as much as I would have liked. But then we follow that up with a 2-parter that is a tribute to O-Ranger, and again, it's fine. I'm not a big O-Ranger fan either, but we do get a new conflict with Bosco, so that makes it a solid episode in its own right. We do get a Dire Ranger tribute as well after that, and it's another pretty average tribute episode. I'm a personal big fan of Dire Ranger as well, so the fact that this episode came out as just kind of average was kind of underwhelming to me personally, but again, it's good. Episodes 35 and 36 are a tribute to Go Onger, which is pretty solid. I mean, it does have some dumb plot points, especially revolving around Falcon. I can't pronounce it. It's Falcon with Mac before it. You get the point. But again, it has some really fun references to the source material, and like the main villain of this arc is the son of the villain from Shinkenger versus Goanger, which is just like, again, a really deep cut there. But this does lead directly into episodes 37-38, which see the defeat of Wars Gill, who was the initial main antagonist of the series, and he ends up being defeated by the first appearance of the Kanzen Gokaiger, which is essentially the best mecha in this series. Though, as I mentioned, I mean, Wars Gill was never really that threatening of a villain. He just came off as kind of a joke most of the time that he was there. But this was an indication that we are starting to reach the end game of the series. Now, after this, we do get a couple tribute episodes. First up, a Mega Ranger tribute, which is another one of the more average tribute episodes there. But we do follow that up with another one of the series' greatest accomplishments, in my opinion, and that is the Time Ranger tribute, which is such a masterfully done episode in my eyes, where, again, it wraps up storylines that were set up years ago. I mean, we get Damon, who is Time Yellow, asking the Gokaigers to go back in time to 2010, so obviously only 1 year before this, where they have to protect the temple. And once they get there, we find out that temple is where Damon's former lover lives, like the person that he was in a relationship during the course of Time Ranger. And we find out that she actually had his kid after he had returned to the future at the end of the series. And we get to the end of the episode with him seeing the picture of his kid for the first time. Again, this is just such an awesome plot thread continued from Time Ranger. Again, a series that aired 11 years ago at the time that this episode aired. So it's like, again, ridiculous that they cared enough to conclude this storyline. But something else this episode does very well as well is also explain the Gokaiger's debut in the Goseiger vs. Shinkenger movie. Now, if you don't know what happens with Sentai typically, is that these versus movies usually show for the first time the appearance of the next team. So Goseiger vs. Shinkenger was supposed to be the first appearance of the Gokaigers. And it was, but it doesn't make sense for them to be in that movie considering it takes place in 2010, as that was before their arrival on Earth, which obviously happened when this series started in 2011. But guess what? This episode explains why they were there. And again, that's just a minor detail they didn't need to answer. Like, they could have just wrote it off as just some like dumb, non-canon introduction that was just there to show the audience who the next team was, but they cared enough to explain this, and all these things together really make this an all-time great episode for me personally. The next few episodes focus on taking down Damaris, and this truly transitions us into the endgame of the series, where we get introduced to the final antagonist of the series in Actos Gill. But before the actual endgame, we do get a couple more tribute episodes that are relatively weak for me personally, and Battle Fever J's tribute episode also acts as a Christmas episode, and that was pretty boring for me personally, though there are some interesting elements of it. And there is a 2-part Kaku Ranger tribute that focuses around Ninja Man, which again doesn't entirely work for me personally. But this leads up to the final 5 episodes of the series, which are all fantastic. The first 2 of which revolve around the final confrontation with Bosco, and there is some really great stuff in these episodes. We do see how brutal Bosco can be, with him sacrificing his own ally in Sally by putting a bomb on him just so that he can get the upper hand in battle against Marvelous. And again, it feels like there's actual stakes here, of part 1 ending with Bosco having taken over the Gokai Galleon, but then part 2 delivers on a really satisfying conclusion to Bosco's character, where again, I just love this final showdown between Marvelous and Bosco, and it's one of the few times in the series that we see people actually get truly injured. We see blood. I also love how they have Sally's death from the previous episode just come back to bite him, where Marvelous is able to survive the final attack from Bosco due to his shot being blocked by a piece of the bomb that was used to kill Sally. I mean, all of that is just really great, a really great 2-parter there. And that leads us to the next episode, where the Gokaigers have finally obtained all of the greater powers, though, I mean, they get the last few in a really dumb way, but whatever. This episode does start the final arc of the season, where the Gokaigers claim the greatest treasure of the universe. And I'll be honest, I think this entire storyline is just kind of dumb. I really didn't like that the treasure is just this generic item that essentially grants them any wish that they want. It essentially allows them to rewrite history. However, if they do so, it will erase the history of the previous Sentai teams as if they never existed. And I get this from a thematic standpoint, from a character development standpoint over the course of the series, as it, again, fits the themes of the series perfectly, where The Gokaigers start this series being very individualistic, not really caring about others, not caring especially about the history of Super Sentai, but through meeting all these characters, using their powers, they grow an appreciation for them. And here, they obviously not end up going through with using the treasure here, but I really feel like a lot of this plot-wise makes no sense. I mean, there's so many like convenient things happening here that really makes it feel like the writers had this idea. Again, they had this really interesting idea that they executed on from a thematic standpoint, but had no real clue of how to get there and how to explain it properly. But this does lead us to the final 2 episodes of the series, which are mostly comprised of battle scenes. It's obviously the final battle between the Gokaigers and the Zanyak Empire. And we start off episode 50 with the Gokaigers using their mechas and all the great powers. And this is really cool, but they obviously end up defeated. And we have like the normal like low point for the hero. And we get this really cool cameo from Goshi from Jew Ranger, and he tells them to go and use the treasure in order to save the world. But they decide obviously to not do it, again showing their development over the course of the series. And then we start the next day when the battle continues. They declare themselves as Super Sentai, and we get this really awesome final episode that, I mean, I guess I could complain that it's almost entirely just fight after fight after fight, but it's still really fun. Again, there's some really great choreography there that really utilizes all the powers that have appeared throughout Super Sentai history. Again, the final fight against Actos Gil is particularly just such a masterfully crafted fight where they use pretty much everything in their arsenal. It's a really satisfying final conclusion and like a final love letter to the super fans of the series. And then we end the actual episode with the Gokaigers leaving Earth for the Zanyak homeworld in order to find another greatest treasure. But before they do, they end up returning all of the powers of the Super Sentai to their original owners. And again, this is another great way to end the series with more cameos, including the original Red Hero in Aka Ranger. And again, this is a fantastic ending. Again, it's very generic. It's very much what you would expect the ending to be, especially with how blatant the themes of the series have been up to this point. But that doesn't mean that they don't execute it well. Again, very heavy-handed, but I do think it's executed in a very satisfying way. But there we go. I mean, that's the entire series of Gokaiger. I feel like I've said most of what I have to say about the series as a whole. Again, a series that meant so much to me when I originally watched it, and considering I actually remembered it was the 10th anniversary of the series, am happy that I actually remembered to make a video about it. It's kind of funny because it's like when I originally made this channel, I definitely planned on talking more about Super Sentai and probably even Power Rangers as well, as I adored this series when I was a kid, and I still retain a lot of that information and knowledge that I had when I was a kid. But with me being so disassociated from the series now, I just haven't really felt like making videos about them, especially because I would still have to do more research, especially for the newer content of these series. And through that, it's just stuff that's not really worth doing for me personally right now. But there are still some Super Sentai and Power Ranger videos I would like to do in the future. I would love to do a season ranking for Power Rangers. Again, who knows when I'll get around to it, but that is something I would love to do. I would love to do more retrospectives for other series down the line. 100%, if I'm still doing YouTube by the time of the 20th anniversary of Forever Red, you can 100% count on me doing a video for that. But as of right now, I don't have any other Super Sentai or Power Ranger videos planned for the immediate future. But again, Gokaiger was something that I personally felt like I needed to talk about at some point, and this was kind of the perfect time to do so. But for now, though, that is the video. Those are my opinions on Gokaiger 10 years after its initial release. Thank you for watching.